Why walk by faith, not by sight, is a spiritual technology opening hook. An introduction. You trust technology you cannot see every single day. Right now, invisible waves are carrying data through the air. Around you, Wi-Fi signals, cellular networks, radio frequencies. You can't see them, touch them, or prove they exist with your naked senses, yet you organize your entire life around them. You trust that when you send a text message, invisible electromagnetic pulses will carry your words across vast distances. You have faith in the unseen architecture of the digital world. This isn't foolishness. It's sophisticated trust in proven systems. Now consider this. What if the biblical injunction to walk by faith, not by sight, isn't primitive religious thinking, but rather instructions for operate an even more sophisticated technology, a spiritual technology that allows you to navigate reality at a level your physical senses cannot access? In 2 Corinthians 5:7, Paul writes, "For we walk by faith, not by sight." For 2 millennia, this verse has been quoted in churches, embroidered on pillows, and reduced to a platitude about trusting God when things get hard. But what if we've been missing something profound? What if this isn't merely advice for difficult times, but rather a description of how reality actually works at its deepest level? What if faith isn't the opposite of reason, but a different kind of perception? What if walking by faith is less about blind belief and more about accessing a frequency of information that your physical eyes simply cannot detect? This script is an exploration of faith as technology, not metaphorically, but functionally. We're going to examine how faith operates as a sophisticated system for perceiving, interpreting, and navigating reality. We'll bridge ancient spiritual wisdom with modern neuroscience, draw parallels with quantum physics, and explore why the practice of walking by faith might be the most practical thing you can do. Because here's the thesis: faith is not the absence of evidence. Faith is a choice to privilege certain kinds of evidence over others. It's a decision about which operating system you'll use to run your life. And like any technology, it must be understood, practiced, and mastered. The problem with sight first. We need to understand what sight means in this context. When Paul says not by sight, he's not talking about physical blindness or ignoring traffic lights. Sight here refers to the evidence of your immediate circumstances, what is empirically observable, measurable, and apparent in your current reality. Walking by sight means making decisions based solely on what you can see, touch, measure, and verify with your physical senses. It means letting your present circumstances dictate your expectations for the future. It means believing that what is visible represents the full truth of your situation. This seems reasonable. After all, we're taught from childhood to believe what we see. Empiricism is the foundation of science. Show me the data. Prove it. I'll believe it when I see it. But here's the problem. Your senses are not giving you objective reality. They're giving you a filtered, interpreted, extremely limited slice of what's actually there. Your eyes can only detect a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum, what we call visible light, which ranges from about 380 to 700 nanometers. Below that is infrared, microwaves, radio waves. Above it is ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays. All of this exists around you constantly, but you're blind to it. A bee sees in ultraviolet, a snake sees in infrared. Your sight is simply one narrow band of available information. Your ears can only hear frequencies between roughly 20 Hz and 20,000 Hz. Elephants communicate in infrasound below your range. Bats navigate using ultrasound above it. Entire conversations are happening around you that you cannot hear. Even time itself is distorted by your perception. Your brain takes about 80 milliseconds to process what you see, meaning you're constantly living in the past, viewing a delayed broadcast of reality that your mind has already interpreted, edited, and reconstructed. So when you walk by sight, you're walking by an extraordinarily limited dataset. You're making decisions based on the narrowest possible bandwidth of information. You're treating the visible as though it were the totality of what's real, when it's actually just the thin surface of a much deeper reality. But the problem goes even deeper than biological limitation. Walking by sight means being trapped in current conditions. If you only believe what you see, you can only create more of what you already have. Your present circumstances become a prison that defines your future possibilities. If you're in debt and you walk by sight, you'll make decisions that keep you in debt, because debt is all you can see. If you're in a broken relationship and you walk by sight, you'll behave in ways that perpetuate the brokenness, because brokenness is your visible reality. If you're sick and you walk by sight, you'll think, feel, and act like a sick person, because sickness is what your senses report. Walking by sight creates a closed loop. The visible defines the possible. The present determines the future. What is becomes what must always be. This is the tyranny of the visible. It's not that visible things are false, they're just incomplete, and when you treat incomplete information as though it were the full picture, you make catastrophically limited decisions. Faith as a perceptual technology, so what's the alternative? If sight is limited, what does it mean to walk by faith instead? Let's start with what faith is not. Faith is not wishful thinking. It's not blind optimism or positive vibes. It's not pretending things are fine when they're not, or denying observable reality. That's not faith, that's delusion. Biblical faith, the kind Paul is describing, is something far more sophisticated. The writer of Hebrews defines it precisely. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Hebrews 11:1. Read that carefully. Faith is substance, it's evidence. These are structural, tangible words. Faith isn't the absence of evidence, it's a different category of evidence. It's evidence that isn't yet visible, but is nevertheless real and substantial. Think of faith as a perceptual technology, a way of processing information that goes beyond sensory input. While sight tells you what is, faith tells you what's possible, what's promised, what's operating beneath the surface of visible circumstances. Faith is the capacity to perceive reality at a deeper level than your senses can access. It's like having infrared vision in a world where everyone else can only see visible light. You're not denying what they see, you're seeing more. Here's how it works mechanically. Your brain is a predictive processing machine. Neuroscience has discovered that your brain doesn't passively receive information from your senses, it actively predicts what it expects to experience, and then updates those predictions based on incoming data. Your perception is actually your brain's best guess about reality, constantly refined by sensory input. This is where faith becomes powerful. Faith is a way of training your predictive processor to anticipate outcomes that aren't yet visible. When you walk by faith, you're essentially telling your brain, I know the current data looks like, but I'm going to operate as though Y is true, because Y aligns with a deeper pattern I trust. This isn't denial. This is working with your brain's architecture. You're consciously choosing which set of predictions will govern your nervous system, your emotions, your decisions, and ultimately your action. When you walk by faith, you're not ignoring your bank account. You're choosing to let a promise carry more weight than a balance. You're not pretending the diagnosis doesn't exist. You're choosing to privilege God's declared nature as healer over the doctor's report. You're not blind to the obstacles. You're choosing to interpret them as temporary data points rather than permanent destination. Faith rewires perception. It changes what you notice, what you emphasize, what you remember, and what you expect. And because your actions flow from your perceptions, faith ultimately changes what you create. Neuroscience calls this neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself based on repeated thoughts and beliefs. When you consistently walk by faith, you're literally rewiring your neural pathways. You're training your mind to recognize patterns of possibility that walking by sight would never detect. The mystics understood this. Brother Lawrence practiced the presence of God, training himself to perceive the invisible reality of God's presence as more substantial than visible circumstances. Ignatius of Loyola developed spiritual exercises specifically designed to strengthen the imagination of faith, the capacity to make the unseen feel more real than the seen. They weren't being mystical for mysticism's sake. They were practicing a perceptual discipline. They were developing spiritual sight as a functional technology. The quantum dimension now, let's go even deeper, into territory that sounds esoteric, but is actually grounded in how reality operates at its most fundamental level. Quantum physics has revealed something extraordinary. At the subatomic level, particles exist in a state of superposition, multiple possible states simultaneously until they're observed. The act of observation literally collapses the wave function, turning possibility into actuality. The famous double-slit experiment demonstrated that light behaves as both particle and wave, and which behavior manifests depends on whether it's being observed. No, I'm not suggesting that faith is quantum mechanics or that you can quantum leap your way to a mansion by thinking positive thoughts. That's a misapplication of quantum principles to macro-level reality. But there is a profound parallel here. In quantum physics, the observer affects the observed. In spiritual physics, the believer affects the believed. Reality at its deepest level is not fixed and deterministic, it's fluid, responsive, probabilistic. There are multiple potential outcomes embedded in every present moment. The future isn't a single track. It's a field of possibilities. Walking by faith is a way of operating from that field of possibility rather than from the narrow track of current circumstances. When you walk by sight, you're observing only what has already collapsed into manifestation, and therefore you perpetuate it. When you walk by faith, you're observing the unseen potential, and your sustained attention on that potential begins to collapse it into reality. This is why Scripture says faith is the substance of things hoped for. Substance doesn't mean I feel good about it. Substance means it has structural reality. In the invisible realm, the quantum field, the spiritual dimension, the realm of potential, the thing you have faith for already exists in seed form. Faith is how you observe it, call it, and midwife it into visible manifestation. The Apostle Paul understood this. He wrote, God calls those things which do not exist as though they did, Romans 4:17. This isn't lying. This is operating from a level where the not yet visible is already structurally present. Think about a seed. When you plant an apple seed, you don't see an apple tree. But is the tree not real? No, it's encoded in the seed. The full tree exists as potential, as information, as destiny. The seed carries the invisible blueprint. Your job is to water it, protect it, and give it time. You're not pretending the tree exists. You're honoring its present but invisible reality. Faith works the same way. The thing God has promised exists in seed form, invisible but real, potential but certain. Walking by faith means treating the seed as though it were already the tree, because in the realm of causation it is. This is why Hebrews 11 catalogues heroes of faith, who died not having received the promises, yet saw them from afar. They saw them, not with physical eyes, but with the eyes of faith. They perceived them in the invisible realm and lived accordingly. Abraham is the prototype. God promised him descendants as numerous as stars, but for decades his circumstances screamed the opposite: old age, barrenness, impossibility. Walking by sight, Abraham had no future. But Romans 4:18-21 says he believed in hope against hope. He did not waver in unbelief but grew strong in faith, giving glory to God, being fully assured that what God had promised, he was able also to perform. Abraham walked by faith. He treated the invisible promise as more real than his visible body. And eventually, the visible caught up to the invisible. Isaac was born. The impossible became actual. The quantum wave collapsed. The operating system, let's make this concrete. How does walking by faith actually work in daily life? Think of faith and sight as two different operating systems like iOS and Android or Windows and Mac. Both can run a computer, but they interpret input differently, prioritize different functions, and produce different outputs. Walking by sight is like running your life on OS Circumstance 1. This operating system interprets everything through the lens of current conditions. Its algorithms are: what I see is what I get. Present evidence equals future outcome. If I can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Walking by faith is like upgrading to OS Promise 2. This operating system interprets everything through the lens of covenant, potential, and divine intention. Its algorithms are: what God says is more real than what I see. Present conditions are temporary data. The invisible governs the visible. Same input, radically different interpretation. Let's take an example. You lose your job. OS Circumstance 1 interprets this as: I'm unemployed, money is running out, I'm falling behind. This is a disaster. That interpretation triggers stress hormones, catastrophic thinking, panic decisions. You start operating from scarcity, fear, and desperation. OS Promise 2 interprets the exact same event differently. This isn't what I planned, but God has promised to provide. This might be a transition, not a tragedy. What doors is this closing? What doors might open? How do I steward this season? This interpretation keeps your nervous system calmer, your thinking clearer, your creativity active. Same circumstances, different operating system. different outcome. Or consider a health crisis. Or a circumstance says the test came back positive. This is my new identity. I am a sick person. My future is limited by this diagnosis. That interpretation shapes your body's stress response, your immune function, even your gene expression. OS promise says this is what the test shows right now. But I know God as healer. I've seen him move before. My body has remarkable capacity for recovery. I'll pursue wisdom medically and simultaneously hold space for the impossible. This doesn't deny medical reality, but it refuses to let medical reality have the final word. Walking by faith doesn't mean you ignore practical wisdom. Abraham didn't refuse to have sex with Sarah because God would do it supernaturally. No, he participated in the natural process while trusting in the supernatural promise. Faith and wisdom work together. Biblical examples abound. Moses stood at the Red Sea with an army behind him and water in front of him. Walking by sight, he was trapped. But God said, move forward. Moses lifted his staff, a natural action, and God parted the waters, a supernatural response. Faith met action. Joshua marched around Jericho's walls for 7 days. Militarily absurd. But he was operating from a different OS, one where obedience to God's word mattered more than military strategy. The walls fell. David faced Goliath. Everyone walking by sight saw an invincible giant and a foolish boy. David saw an uncircumcised Philistine defying the armies of the living God. Same battlefield, different perception. David won. The woman with the issue of blood pressed through a crowd to touch Jesus' garment. Sight said, you're unclean, weak, broke, out of options. Faith said, if I can just touch his garment, I will be healed. She operated from faith. She was healed. In each case, these people made practical choices, raised a staff, marched around walls, picked up stones, pushed through a crowd, but their choices were governed by faith, not sight. The resistance and the practice, here's the hard part. Walking by faith is profoundly difficult because it goes against every survival instinct in your body. Your brain evolved to keep you alive, not to make you faithful, and from a survival perspective, trusting the visible is smart. If you see a lion, you run. If you see fire, you don't touch it. Your senses exist to keep you safe by responding to immediate, tangible threats. Faith asks you to override that system. It asks you to not react to what you see, but to respond to what you believe. This creates massive internal resistance. When your bank account is near zero, every cell in your body is screaming, panic, this is dangerous, fix this now. Walking by faith in that moment feels like walking off a cliff. Your nervous system is in full revolt. When a relationship is collapsing, every instinct says, control this, force it, make it work. Walking by faith means surrendering control, which feels like death. When you're sick and getting worse, your body's alarm systems are blaring. Walking by faith requires you to quiet those alarms long enough to hear a different voice. This is why faith is called a walk, not a leap or a sprint. It's a daily, moment-by-moment practice of choosing which operating system you'll run, and it requires discipline. So how do you practice walking by faith? Here are practical tools. 1. Redirect your attention consciously. Your mind will naturally fixate on what you can see. Practice deliberately shifting your focus to what God has said. When anxiety about money rises, don't suppress it, acknowledge it, then redirect. I see the balance. I also remember that God has never failed to provide. Both are true. I choose to privilege the promise. 2. Speak what you believe, not just what you see. Your words shape your perception. If you constantly narrate your circumstances, I'm broke, I'm stuck, I'm hopeless, you reinforce sight-based thinking. Instead, declare what you know by faith. God is my provider. He makes a way where there is no way. I'm watching for his movement. 3. Act as though the invisible were real. Faith without works is dead. If you say you believe God will provide, but you're hoarding, anxious and paralyzed, you're still walking by sight. Act with the generosity, peace, and boldness of someone who knows provision is coming. 4. Build a catalog of past faithfulness. Your brain loves evidence. Give it evidence of faith's track record. Journal prayers God has answered. Rehearse moments when he came through. David did this constantly in the Psalms. I remember the days of old. I remember your wonders of old. Memory fuels faith. 5. Surround yourself with faith speakers. You'll be tempted to walk by sight constantly because everyone around you does. Find people who operate from OS promise. Their faith will stabilize yours. 6. Practice in small things. Don't wait for a crisis to start walking by faith. Practice in low-stakes situations. Trust God with parking spaces, small needs, daily provisions. Build the muscle in the gym before you need it in battle. Walking by faith is like physical exercise. The first time you lift weights, it's uncomfortable and awkward, but repetition builds strength. Eventually, what once felt impossible becomes natural. The evidence paradox. Here's the beautiful paradox of faith. Faith doesn't ignore evidence. It eventually produces evidence. But the evidence comes after faith, not before. This is the sequence that most people miss. We want to see, then believe. But the spiritual technology operates in reverse. Believe, then see. Hebrews 11:1 says faith is evidence of things not seen. This means faith itself functions as evidence. Your confidence in the invisible is the proof that it's real, not yet visible proof, but substantive proof nonetheless. Abraham is the clearest example of this principle. God promised him a son when he was 75 years old and childless. For 25 years, Abraham had no visible evidence. Every year that passed screamed, the promise is false, you're deluded, give up. But Romans 4:20 says Abraham did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith. Notice, he grew strong in faith while the evidence weakened. His body got older. Sarah's womb became deader. The visible circumstances deteriorated. But Abraham was operating from a different data set. He was watching the invisible. And at 100 years old, when sight would have declared the situation impossible, Isaac was born. The invisible became visible. The promise materialized. This is the pattern throughout Scripture. Noah built an ark for rain he'd never seen. The evidence came after obedience. Joseph believed he would rule. Despite being sold, enslaved, and imprisoned, the throne came after the pit. Moses led people toward a land he'd never visited. The promised land appeared after the wilderness. The pattern is always the same. Faith first, evidence later. The visible is always the lagging indicator of the invisible. This is why walking by faith is so challenging. You're asked to trust before you see, to move before you have proof, to believe while circumstances argue otherwise. It violates everything our sight-based culture teaches us, but this is precisely what makes faith powerful. If you only move when you have evidence, you're not operating by faith. You're operating by sight. Faith is specifically designed for the gap between promise and manifestation, between word and fulfillment, between seed and harvest. And here's what most people miss. Your faith during the gap is not passive waiting. Your faith is actively creating the conditions for manifestation. Your sustained belief, your decisions aligned with promise rather than circumstances, your action rooted in confidence. These are the very mechanisms through which the invisible becomes visible. You're not just waiting for God to do something. You're participating in the process. You're the womb in which the promise gestates. Your faith is the environment in which the seed grows. Let's bring this home. Walk by faith, not by sight, is not religious poetry. It's an instruction manual for operating reality at a level your physical senses cannot access. We've seen that sight empirical observation of current circumstances is radically limited. Your senses give you a narrow bandwidth of information, and when you make decisions based solely on what you see, you lock yourself into the prison of present conditions. Faith is the alternative technology. It's a perceptual system that allows you to access deeper patterns, to see potential where sight sees only obstacles, to recognize the invisible architecture underlying visible reality. This isn't mysticism, it's mechanics. Your brain is designed to operate on prediction and expectation. Faith is how you consciously direct those predictions toward outcome, aligned with divine promise rather than current circumstances. We've explored the quantum parallels, how reality at its deepest level is fluid and responsive, and how sustained observation of the invisible begins to collapse it into manifestation. We've examined practical application, how faith and sight function as competing operating systems that interpret the same input in radically different ways. We've Acknowledge the resistance that walking by faith goes against survival instincts and requires disciplined practice. And we've uncovered the evidence paradox that faith doesn't ignore evidence. It produces evidence, but only after you've chosen to believe. So here's the question: which operating system are you running? Are you walking by sight, letting your bank account, your diagnosis, your past failures, your current limitations define your future? Are you trapped in the tyranny of the visible, making decisions based on the narrowest possible dataset? Or are you willing to upgrade to a different OS? Are you willing to walk by faith, to treat the promises of God as more real than your present circumstances, to act on what you believe rather than react to what you see, to privilege the invisible over the visible? This is an invitation, not to deny reality, but to perceive a deeper reality. This is a call, not to blind optimism, but to sophisticated trust in a proven system. The spiritual technology of faith is available to you, but like any technology, it must be engaged, practiced, and mastered. Here are your next steps. Identify where you're walking by sight. What area of your life is currently governed by what you see rather than what you believe? Name it. Find the promise. What has God said about this area? What does Scripture declare about provision, healing, relationships, purpose? Anchor yourself in that word. Make one faith decision today. Take one action, however small, that aligns with the promise rather than the circumstance. Tithe when it doesn't make sense. Apply for the job you feel unqualified for. Speak peace over your body. Act as though the invisible were real. Track your evidence. Start a journal of moments when walking by faith produced results. Build your catalog. Strengthen your expectation. Repeat. Faith is a walk, not an event. Do this daily. Build the muscle. Develop the discipline. Remember, you already trust invisible technology every day. Wi-Fi, electricity, gravity. You organize your life around forces you cannot see but have learned to rely on. The spiritual technology of faith is no different. It's been proven over millennia by millions of practitioners. Patriarchs, prophets, apostles, martyrs, ordinary believers all walked by faith, not by sight, and all saw the invisible become visible. The technology is available. The question is whether you'll engage it. Will you walk by sight or by faith? The choice and the outcome are yours. Have you ever wondered why, despite years of prayer, meditation, and spiritual practice, you still feel like God is somehow distant, just out of reach? What if I told you that the very thing you've been searching for has been speaking to you all along, not from the heavens above, but from the deepest chamber of your own being? For most of your life, you've probably been taught to look outward for divine guidance. You've been conditioned to believe that God's voice comes from external sources, through religious texts, spiritual teachers, or perhaps in moments of quiet desperation when you cry out for help. But what if this entire approach has been keeping you from the most profound spiritual awakening you could ever experience? What if the voice of God isn't something you need to reach for, but something you need to recognize within yourself? Has this ever happened to you? You face a crisis, maybe a health scare, a financial disaster, or a relationship falling apart, and you pray with every fiber of your being, asking God for intervention, for a sign, for anything. Yet somehow, the silence feels deafening. You wonder if you're not worthy enough, not faithful enough, not spiritual enough to receive an answer. But here's the revolutionary truth that changes everything. God has been answering you all along. The problem is, you've been listening for an external voice when the divine has been speaking from the very consciousness that asks the question. But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. What you're about to discover might surprise you because it completely dismantles everything conventional religion has taught us about our relationship with the divine. When you finally hear God speak from within, something extraordinary happens. It's not a booming voice from the clouds or a mystical experience reserved for saints and prophets. It's a profound recognition, a sudden knowing that the presence you've been seeking outside yourself is actually the very essence of who you are. This isn't blasphemy or spiritual arrogance. It's the same truth that Jesus revealed when he declared, "I am," demonstrating that God's presence wasn't separate from his being, but was his true identity. Stay with me until the end, because understanding this principle doesn't just change your spiritual life, it transforms your entire existence. When you stop begging a distant deity for help and recognize that the divine voice has always been speaking through your deepest intuition, your clearest moments of knowing, your most authentic self, everything shifts. Your prayers transform from desperate pleas into powerful recognitions. Your spiritual journey stops being a climb toward something you don't have and becomes an unveiling of what has always been present. The moment this truth begins to awaken in you, years of spiritual frustration start to make sense. All those times you felt unheard weren't because God was ignoring you, it's because you were looking in the wrong direction. Think about this for a moment. Every single day, probably dozens of times, you make declarations about yourself without even realizing the profound impact these words carry. You wake up and say, "I am tired." You look at your bank account and think, "I am broke." You feel a pain in your body and declare, "I am sick." These seem like innocent observations about your current circumstances, right? But here's the hidden truth that most people never grasp. You're not describing reality, you're actually creating it. When God speaks from within and you finally hear it, one of the first revelations that floods your consciousness is understanding what "I am" truly means. This isn't about your personality, your history, your job title, or the roles you play in life. Those are all temporary costumes you wear, masks that change depending on the situation. The "I am" that speaks from within isn't connected to any of these surface identities. It's something infinitely deeper, infinitely more powerful. It's consciousness itself expressing through the unique form that is you, timeless, boundless, eternal presence made visible in this moment. If you want to continue exploring these transformative spiritual principles, subscribe to the channel. I share practical insights that go beyond theory and actually shift your experience of life. The transformation in your mindset begins when you realize you've been unconsciously attaching this sacred phrase to every limitation you experience. Behind the scenes of your daily life, there's been a constant stream of declarations shaping your reality in ways you never understood. I am not good enough. I am afraid. I am stuck. Each time you speak these words, you're not just making observations, you're claiming these temporary conditions as your true identity. You're taking the infinite and binding it to the finite. You're saying that the divine presence expressing as you is limited, lacking, or broken. Has this ever happened to you? You've tried everything to change a situation, worked harder, prayed more fervently, sought advice from others, yet nothing seems to shift. The reason is simple but profound. You can't transform what you keep claiming as your identity. If you wake every morning declaring, "I am struggling," then struggle becomes the very fabric of your experience. Not because struggle is your destiny, but because you've crowned it as your truth. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because what you're about to understand will reveal why some people seem to effortlessly attract healing, abundance, and breakthrough moments, while others remain stuck despite their best efforts. The difference isn't in their circumstances or even in how hard they work. It's in how they use these two powerful words. When you attach "I am" to truth rather than to temporary conditions, reality itself begins to reorganize around that higher consciousness. You're not trying to change things anymore. You're recognizing what has always been true beneath the surface of appearances. Write in the comments, "I'm recognizing my true identity," if this perspective is beginning to shift something inside you. The most liberating revelation that comes from hearing God speak within is this: your suffering has never been about your circumstances. It's been about mistaken identity. Behind the scenes of every struggle you've ever faced, there's been a fundamental confusion about who you really are. You've been attaching the eternal essence of your being to temporary conditions, claiming that the infinite presence expressing as you is somehow limited, broken, or lacking. And this single error in perception has been the source of every experience of pain, fear, and limitation you've endured. Think about the impact of this realization on your entire life journey. For years, maybe decades, you've been trying to fix yourself. You've sought healing for your body, solutions for your finances, answers to your relationship problems. You've prayed for God to change your circumstances, to remove obstacles, to make things better. But what if there's nothing to fix? What if the problem isn't your circumstances at all, but the fact that you've been claiming those circumstances as your identity? When the divine voice awakens within you, something extraordinary happens with healing. You suddenly understand that you don't heal the body in the way you've always thought. You're not making something sick become well. You're recognizing a truth that has always been present. The I of your being, the consciousness, the presence, the essence of who you are, was never sick to begin with. The body may display symptoms. Absolutely. Pain might be real in the physical experience, but that's not you. That's not your true identity. The infinite presence that looks through your eyes, that breathes through your lungs, that animates this physical form, that presence is whole, complete, and perfect right now. This isn't positive thinking or denial of what's happening in your physical experience. It's a profound shift in understanding what you are versus what you have. You have a body. You are not the body. You have emotions. You are not the emotions. You have thoughts. You are not the thoughts. The I am that God speaks as you is beyond all of these temporary changing conditions. And when you finally hear this truth spoken from within, when it becomes more real to you than the symptoms or circumstances, that's when transformation happens naturally, without force, without struggle. The hidden truth behind every miraculous healing throughout history has been this recognition. People weren't healed because they convinced God to intervene. They were healed because they stopped identifying their true self with the condition. They heard the divine voice within declaring wholeness, and they recognized it as more true than what their physical senses were telling them. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because understanding the mechanics of how this actually works in your daily life changes everything. When you wake up tomorrow morning and your first thought is about pain or limitation, you'll have a decision to make. A choice that determines whether you continue in suffering or step into the freedom that's always been available. Drop a comment saying, "I am not my circumstances," if you're beginning to see through the illusion of false identity. Here's where most people get stuck on their spiritual journey, and it's a distinction that changes everything once you understand it. There's a massive difference between affirmation and recognition, and confusing the two keeps people trapped in cycles of effort without breakthrough. Affirmations are statements you repeat, hoping to make something true that you currently believe is false. You affirm, "I am abundant," while feeling broke. You declare, "I am healthy," while experiencing pain. You say, "I am loved," while feeling utterly alone. And behind the scenes, there's this constant struggle, this exhausting effort to convince yourself and the universe that something is real when your entire experience seems to prove otherwise. Recognition is completely different. It doesn't try to create anything. It simply acknowledges what has always been present, what is eternally true, regardless of temporary appearances. When God speaks from within and you hear it, you're not creating a new reality. You're recognizing the reality that exists beneath the surface of all conditions. This is why affirmations often feel forced and leave you feeling more drained than empowered. You're fighting against what you perceive as true. But recognition rests in what is true. independent of perception or circumstances. The impact of understanding this distinction transforms how you approach every challenge. You stop trying to make things happen and start recognizing what already is. You're not climbing toward wholeness. You're acknowledging the wholeness that's always been your foundation. One path exhausts you with endless effort. The other allows you to rest in truth. This brings us to something incredibly practical that you can use immediately, and it might be the most powerful tool you'll ever discover. When crisis hits, when fear grips your chest, when panic floods your mind, when circumstances seem overwhelming and impossible, there's a practice that interrupts the entire cycle of reaction. It's called the pause. Instead of immediately reacting, instead of frantically searching for solutions, instead of letting your mind spiral into worst-case scenarios, you simply stop. You pause everything. In that pause, you ask yourself one question: what is the truth of my being right now? Not what appears to be happening, not what you're afraid might happen, not what the circumstances seem to prove, but what is eternally, unchangeably true about the I am that you are. And here's what you discover every single time you genuinely ask this question. The answer is always the same. The I am is whole. The I am is complete. The I am is safe, supplied, and perfect. Not because you made it so through positive thinking, but because this is the nature of infinite presence, which is what you actually are beneath all the temporary identities you've been wearing. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because when you start practicing this pause in your daily life, you begin to notice something remarkable happening. The problems that seemed so solid, so real, so impossible to overcome start to shift in ways you could never have orchestrated through human effort alone. Type, "I choose to pause," in the comments if you're ready to interrupt the pattern of reaction and rest in truth. Something profound happens when you consistently practice this pause and begin hearing God speak from within. You start to see other people completely differently. The entire framework of separation that's governed your relationships, your judgments, your fears about others begins to crumble. You've been living as if you're a separate island, disconnected from everyone around you, competing for limited resources, protecting yourself from potential harm. But when the divine voice awakens in your consciousness, you realize this has all been an elaborate illusion. The same I am that expresses as you is the true identity of every person you encounter. Behind the personalities, the behaviors, the words they speak, the actions they take, there's this same infinite presence looking through different eyes. This doesn't mean everyone is behaving from that awareness. Most people are completely asleep to their true nature, operating from fear, lack, and separation. But their true identity remains unchanged, just as yours does, regardless of how unconscious you've been. The impact of this revelation on your daily interactions is extraordinary. You stop taking things personally. When someone lashes out at you, you recognize they're not attacking you. They're lost in the dream of separation, acting from a false sense of self. You don't need to defend yourself or retaliate, because you see through the illusion to the truth beneath. This isn't about being passive or allowing harmful behavior. It's about responding from wisdom rather than reacting from wounded ego. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because when you understand that separation is an illusion, something else becomes crystal clear. Your source has never been external. Your entire life, you've believed that your supply comes from your job, your clients, your investments, your spouse, your parents, the economy, the government. You've lived with constant anxiety about these sources disappearing or failing you. Behind the scenes of every financial worry has been this belief that something outside yourself is responsible for your well-being. If this video resonated with you or shifted your perspective, hit the like button. It helps others who are searching for these truths find their way here. But when God speaks from within, You hear the most liberating truth you'll ever encounter. The infinite I Am is your source, not your employer, not your business, not any person or institution. These are merely channels through which supply flows, and channels can change, dry up or multiply without affecting the source itself. The source is consciousness, the divine presence expressing as your being, and that source is infinite, inexhaustible, always flowing. This mindset transformation doesn't mean you quit your job or ignore practical responsibilities. It means you stop giving power to circumstances and recognize where power actually resides. When you live from this consciousness, something remarkable begins happening. Abundance starts appearing through unexpected channels, opportunities you never pursued, connections that seem coincidental, ideas that arrive fully formed. You're not manipulating or forcing anything. You're simply aligned with the natural flow of infinite supply that has always been available. Share "My source is within" in the comments if this understanding is beginning to shift your relationship with abundance. This understanding of internal source doesn't just transform your relationship with money and resources. It revolutionizes how you show up in every relationship. Think about the hidden truth behind most relationship problems. People enter partnerships seeking completion. They feel empty, so they look for someone to fill that void. They feel unloved, so they need someone to love them. They feel incomplete, so they search for their other half. And this creates an exhausting dynamic where two incomplete people try to extract wholeness from each other, which is impossible. When you hear God speak from within and recognize that I Am is infinite love itself, the entire foundation of relationships shifts. You're not seeking anymore. You're not trying to get love. You're expressing the love that you are. You're not looking for completion because you've discovered you're already whole. The emptiness you felt wasn't real lack. It was simply forgetting your true nature. And the moment you remember, relationships transform from transactions into expressions. Instead of two people trading neediness, you have the sharing of fullness. Instead of demanding that someone make you happy, you bring joy that naturally overflows from recognizing what you are. This doesn't mean you don't desire partnership or connection. It means you desire it from a completely different place. You're not desperate. You're not clinging. You're not afraid of being alone. Because you've discovered you're never actually alone. The infinite presence is always with you, as you, expressing through you. Has this ever happened to you? You finally let go of needing someone, and suddenly the right person appears. That's not coincidence. That's what happens when you stop operating from lack and start living from wholeness. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because this same principle transforms how you experience work. For most people, work is survival. It's something they must do to pay bills, to get by, to maintain their lifestyle. There's constant pressure, stress about performance, fear of losing the job, exhaustion from forcing themselves through tasks they don't enjoy. Behind the scenes of this struggle is the belief that work is separate from your true purpose, that it's just a means to an end. But when the divine voice speaks from within, work becomes something entirely different. It stops being about survival and becomes about expression. Your job isn't something you must do anymore. It's how infinite intelligence and creativity flow into visible form through you. You're not working for money. You're allowing the divine presence that you are to express itself in the world, and money flows naturally as a result. The tasks that once felt heavy become lighter because you're not doing them alone. You're not relying solely on human effort and limited thinking. You're an open channel for something far greater than your personal abilities. Type "I am an open channel" in the comments if you're ready to let work become expression rather than survival. When this transformation deepens in your consciousness, one of the most liberating shifts happens in how you see yourself and others. Judgment, that constant inner critic that's been running commentary on everything you do and everything others do, begins to dissolve. Not because you force yourself to be less judgmental, but because you finally understand what judgment actually is. It's one false identity criticizing another false identity. It's the ego attacking the ego, personal sense judging personal sense, while the true I am of your being watches it all without participating. Think about the impact this has on your daily experience. When someone cuts you off in traffic, when a co-worker says something hurtful, when a family member acts selfishly, your automatic reaction has always been judgment. But when you hear God speak from within, you recognize something profound. These people aren't their behaviors. They're acting from fear, anger, or greed because they've forgotten who they truly are. They're operating from a false sense of identity, just as you once did, just as you still do sometimes when you forget. Their true nature, the I am that they are, is the same divine presence that you are. They're just asleep to it. This understanding doesn't mean you tolerate abuse or ignore harmful behavior. It means you respond from wisdom rather than wounded ego. You set boundaries from clarity rather than anger. Behind the scenes of this shift, there's a quiet compassion that emerges. Not pity, but genuine recognition that everyone is on this journey of remembering who they are, and most people are still deep in the dream of separation. The same compassion extends to yourself. When you make mistakes, when you fall short of your ideals, when you act from fear instead of love, you stop the vicious cycle of self-judgment. You recognize that the mistake happened in the dream of personal identity, not in your true nature. The I am, that you are never failed, never sinned, never fell short. You simply forgot yourself for a moment, and now you remember again. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because what we're really talking about here is integration. The point where this understanding stops being something you think about occasionally and becomes your natural state of being. In the beginning, you practice recognizing I am during meditation or when facing challenges. You consciously remember the truth. But as God's voice becomes clearer within you, something remarkable happens. The practice becomes your identity. You don't switch it on and off anymore. You wake as I am. You walk as I am. You work, love, speak, and rest as I am. It's no longer something you do. It's who you are. Right, I am integrating this truth in the comments if you're experiencing this shift from practice to being. This integration creates something that might seem miraculous to others, but feels perfectly natural to you. Problems begin to dissolve without the struggle you once thought was necessary. Think about how you've approached challenges throughout your life. You've analyzed, strategized, fought, manipulated, forced, and exhausted yourself trying to fix things. You've believed that solutions require massive human effort, that breakthrough demands endless grinding, that transformation happens through willpower and determination. But when you live from the consciousness of I am, when you consistently hear God speak from within, something completely different happens. The problems that seemed impossible start to shift on their own. Not because you're doing nothing, you're still taking inspired action when needed, but because you're no longer blocking the natural flow of resolution with false identity. Behind the scenes, there's been this constant interference pattern created by identifying as limited, lacking, or broken. The moment you stop claiming those identities, the interference stops, and what needs to happen happens naturally, often through channels you never expected and couldn't have orchestrated through personal effort alone. Needs get met through synchronistic encounters. Solutions appear as sudden insights that feel like they dropped from nowhere. Doors open that you didn't even know existed. And here's what makes this so different from the law of attraction or manifestation techniques you might have tried. You're not trying to make anything happen. You're simply being what you are, and reality organizes itself around that truth. The impact of this shift on your entire life journey cannot be overstated. You move from exhausting effort to effortless being, from constant struggle to natural flow. This is the ultimate freedom that Jesus demonstrated when he walked the earth. He wasn't a limited human trying to become spiritual through discipline and effort. He was spirit appearing in human form, fully engaged in human experience, while resting in divine truth. He was the wave that knew itself as the ocean. And this is exactly what happens when you finally hear God speak from within and live from that recognition. You're not trying to be spiritual anymore. You're not working toward enlightenment. You're not climbing a ladder to reach some higher state. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because understanding this intellectually is one thing, but actually living it, embodying it in the midst of real challenges, financial pressure, health concerns, relationship difficulties, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where you discover whether this truth is just a beautiful philosophy or a practical power that transforms every aspect of your existence. Share "I am the wave, knowing the ocean" in the comments. If this understanding of ultimate freedom is resonating with something deep inside you, you know if you've made it. This far with me, I have a feeling this message found you at exactly the right moment in your journey. These aren't easy concepts to stay with. They challenge everything we've been taught about who we are and how life works. But something inside you recognized the truth in these words, didn't it? That's the divine voice speaking, confirming what you've always known beneath the noise of the world. If you found value in this exploration and want to continue deepening your understanding of these spiritual principles, I'd love to have you subscribe to the channel. I share content like this regularly, practical wisdom that you can actually apply to transform your daily experience, not just theory that sounds nice but doesn't change anything. These teachings are meant to be lived, and I'm here walking this path right alongside you. Leave a comment saying this message was meant for me, so I know you made it all the way through. I genuinely read the comments and love seeing who's on this journey with us. It creates a beautiful community of people who are waking up to their true nature. And if this video resonated with you, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps this content reach others who might be searching for exactly what you just discovered. Sometimes one video can completely shift someone's perspective, and your simple action of liking helps make that connection possible. There's a video right here that takes this even further, exploring how to actually apply these principles when you're in the middle of a crisis and everything feels overwhelming. Click and continue with me over there. Let's keep going deeper together. 1. The weight of a world in turmoil. To understand why Jesus' phrase, "My yoke is easy," was so revolutionary, you must first understand the world in which he spoke it. His words were not floating in an abstract spiritual vacuum. They were spoken to real people whose lives were shaped by political fear, cultural tension, religious exhaustion, and deep spiritual hunger. A land, once proud of its identity, was now under the boot of the Roman Empire, a world superpower with soldiers on every corner and laws that could not be questioned. Taxes were heavy, emotions were tense, and hope felt like a fading memory. And yet, behind the political pressure was an even heavier burden, the crushing weight of trying to live up to a religious system that demanded more than any human could ever give. In this context, Jesus didn't merely teach, he interrupted the despair of an entire generation. When he said, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest," he wasn't speaking to people who had a mild case of stress. He was speaking to a nation being suffocated physically, emotionally, spiritually, and socially. To them, the idea of an easy yoke was almost unthinkable. Life was anything but easy. Religion was anything but restful. Everything in their world was heavy. And into this heaviness, Jesus opened his heart. 2. Jewish life under Roman occupation. Imagine waking up every morning knowing your land is not your own. Roman soldiers march through villages. Roman law overrides your law. Roman rulers demand taxes you can barely afford. Every family felt the pressure. To resist Rome was to risk execution. To submit to Rome was to feel humiliated. To ignore Rome was impossible. Most people lived on the edge financially, emotionally, and spiritually. Fear was normal, anxiety was common, grief was everywhere. And yet, beyond the external oppression, something internal was breaking too. People didn't simply want relief from Rome. They wanted relief from the tiring expectation to be good enough for God. Rome was the burden they could see. Religion was the burden they could feel. This combination made life almost unbearable. 3. The weight of religious expectation, Judaism, in the first century was not the simple, elegant faith God gave Moses. Over the centuries, layers of rules, interpretations, additions, and traditions had been built on top of the original commands. What began as a covenant relationship had become a system of pressure. The Pharisees, the experts of the law, believed they were helping the people honor God, but their methods were rigid, their interpretations were strict, their expectations were nearly impossible. The result? People lived under a spiritual cloud of not enoughness. No matter how hard they tried, they always fell short. Not praying enough, not memorizing enough, not sacrificing enough, not avoiding sin carefully enough, not observing every rule exactly enough. Religion had become a treadmill with no finish line. The common person believed God was perpetually disappointed with them. They lived with constant fear of failing him. And then Jesus arrived not to condemn them, but to rescue them from the very system that was supposed to save them. 4. The gravitational pull of guilt. Guilt was everywhere. It wasn't guilt from committing crimes. It was guilt from being human. People felt guilty for not understanding Scripture well enough, guilty for not keeping every Sabbath rule precisely, guilty for having doubts or fears, guilty for feeling tired, discouraged, or overwhelmed. Life itself seemed sinful. Religion was supposed to draw people to God, but instead it pushed them into cycles of endless self-condemnation. This burden, the burden of believing that God's love must be earned, was the heaviest yoke of all. When Jesus said, "My burden is light," he was speaking directly into this emotional prison. 5. Why Jesus' words were so shocking into this world of pressure and despair. Jesus spoke a message nobody expected. The kingdom of God is near. God is not far away. God is not angry with you. God is not impossible to please. God does not require you to destroy yourself to satisfy him. God is gentle and humble in heart. God's way gives rest, not exhaustion. Imagine hearing this after a lifetime of believing the opposite. Imagine hearing a rabbi tell you that God's yoke is easy. For the first century Jewish listener, this was not merely comforting, it was revolutionary. You didn't need to strive endlessly. You didn't need to fear continually. You didn't need to prove yourself daily. Jesus was offering a relationship instead of a religious performance, a partnership instead of punishment, a yoke that fits instead of a yoke that crushes. This is why crowds gathered. This is why sinners felt safe. This is why the weary felt hope rising in their chests. Someone finally told them the truth about God, and that someone was God himself. 6. The meaning of a yoke in ancient culture. To fully understand Jesus' words, we must step into the agricultural world of the first century. Most people were farmers or lived close to the rhythms of farming life. The image of a yoke was familiar to everyone. A yoke was a wooden beam carved to fit around the neck of oxen, a tool used to keep two animals walking together, a way to share a load so neither animal carried it alone, a symbol of partnership, alignment, and shared purpose. A farmer who cared for his animals did not simply create a yoke. He crafted a well-fitting, tailored yoke one shaped to the body of the animal so it wouldn't rub, bruise, or injure them. A good yoke meant less pain, more strength, longer endurance, better cooperation, more efficiency. A bad yoke meant blisters, bleeding exhaustion, constant pain, frustration, early death. Jesus didn't say, "I remove the yoke." He said, "My yoke is easy." This means he doesn't remove purpose, direction, or responsibility from our lives. Instead, he gives us a way to live that fits us, one that is aligned with how we were created, one that does not injure us, one that makes us stronger and more free. In the ancient world, rabbis used the word yoke metaphorically as well. A yoke was a rabbi's teaching interpretation of scripture, lifestyle expectations way of following God. To take on a rabbi's yoke meant to apprentice under him, to adopt his worldview, to follow his rhythm of life. So when Jesus said, "Take my yoke upon you," he was inviting his followers into his way of life, his rhythm, his posture, his gentleness, his relationship with the Father, and his understanding of what truly matters. This was not a burden, it was an invitation into alignment. 7. The burdens people lived with daily. When you combine Roman oppression with religious pressure, you get a society filled with chronic exhaustion. The average person in Jesus' time carried burdens that touched every part of life. Physical burdens, long hours of manual labor, heavy taxes that consumed nearly half their income, regular food insecurity, harsh weather and limited resources, lack of medical care, emotional burdens, fear of Roman soldiers, anxiety over finances. Hopelessness about the future, deep grief over oppression, constant comparison to religious elites, spiritual burdens, the feeling that God was always disappointed, shame from failing to keep hundreds of minor laws, confusion about Scripture, a constant internal voice saying, "You are not enough," pressure to perform to earn God's approval, social burdens, judgment from neighbors, fear of being labeled unclean, shame from sins or mistakes, pressure to fit into religious systems, worry about the safety of family members. These burdens did not come one at a time, they compounded. A person who felt physically exhausted was also emotionally fatigued. A person who felt spiritually inadequate was also socially insecure. This is why Jesus' words struck so deeply. He was not a detached teacher discussing abstract theology. He was speaking directly to the pain people lived with every day. 8. A people desperate for relief. We often forget that people in Jesus' time were just as human as we are. Their anxieties, dreams, worries and insecurities were not ancient, they were universal. They longed for a sense of worth, a sense of belonging, a sense of security, a sense of purpose, a sense of peace. They wanted to know they mattered. They wanted to know God saw them. They wanted to know their suffering had meaning. They wanted to know their efforts were not wasted. They wanted to know they were not spiritually hopeless. Religion, instead of soothing these longings, often made them worse. Imagine a doctor adding pressure to a broken bone instead of treating it. Imagine a teacher increasing homework for a child who is already overwhelmed. Imagine a spiritual leader demanding more effort from someone who is already drowning in responsibilities. This is what first-century Jews experienced. They were being crushed by systems that promise spiritual life but produce spiritual suffocation. This is why Jesus' message was like oxygen to a suffocating society. 9. The spiritual leaders of the day, the Pharisees and scribes, believed they were doing the will of God. Many of them were sincere. Many genuinely thought they were protecting the purity of the faith. But sincerity without compassion becomes cruelty, and passion without humility becomes pride. Jesus described them vividly. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear. They lay them on people's shoulders. They will not lift a finger to help. They love to be seen as holy. They strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. The problem was not the law itself. The problem was how the law had been weaponized. The leaders acted as spiritual gatekeepers, deciding who was acceptable and who was not. They created a world where holiness was measured by external performance instead of internal transformation. They believed righteousness was something you could achieve through perfect behavior, perfect obedience, perfect ritual, perfect sacrifice. But Jesus taught a different way. Holiness begins with the heart. Transformation begins with grace. Righteousness begins with relationship, not performance. 10. The growing despair of the people. By the time Jesus appeared on the scene, most people had quietly accepted the lie that God was unreachable. They believed they would never be spiritual enough. They would never be pure enough. They would never be obedient enough. They would never understand enough. They would never measure up. If you ask the average Jewish man or woman whether they thought God was happy with them, the answer was almost always, no, I'm not good enough. This despair was fertile soil for the gospel. People were ready hungry for a message that didn't simply demand more effort, but offered more rest. And then Jesus came, not demanding, not condemning, not performing holiness to impress, not shaming the weak. He came with gentleness, with truth, with authority, with rest, a rest unlike anything they had ever known. 11. The psychological toll of never feeling enough. When Jesus stepped into the religious atmosphere of his day, he found a people not just physically tired or spiritually discouraged. They were psychologically exhausted. Centuries before the terms mental health, anxiety disorders, or depression existed, people were suffering deeply from the internal weight of trying to be perfect. A spiritual system based on rule-keeping and performance creates predictable emotional consequences. A. Chronic anxiety. People feared every mistake, every impurity, every misstep. What if I accidentally broke the Sabbath? What if I forgot a detail of the law? What if God rejects me? Anxiety grew like vines in the soul. B. Persistent shame. Shame is not the feeling of, I did something wrong. Shame is the feeling of, something is wrong with me. And that is exactly what many people believed. They weren't just struggling, they were fundamentally flawed. C. Deep hopelessness. If spiritual success feels impossible, eventually people stop trying. A lifetime of failure conditions you to expect nothing good. D. Exhaustion. Striving without rest drains a person's emotional reserves. People lived with a constant internal pressure. Do more. Try harder. Be better. Don't fail. Don't fall. Don't disappoint God. Jesus did not ignore this psychological toll. He addressed it head-on with his invitation, "Come to me, and I will give you rest." Rest from what? From anxiety, from shame, from hopelessness, from emotional exhaustion. He was offering inner healing, not just spiritual teaching. 12. The social hierarchy of spirituality. In Jesus' day, spirituality was not a level playing field. There was an unspoken hierarchy. Pharisees seen as the most holy, scribes seen as the most knowledgeable, priests seen as intermediaries between God and man, men viewed as spiritually responsible, women valued but often minimized spiritually, children considered insignificant in religious discussions, tax collectors, sinners, and the uneducated considered spiritually hopeless. This hierarchy created two painful realities. A. Some people were exalted. They believed they were spiritually superior, closer to God, more acceptable. B. Others were crushed. They believed they were spiritually inferior, distant from God, never acceptable. Into this hierarchy, Jesus spoke revolutionary words. "Blessed are the poor in spirit. The last shall be first. Let the little children come to me. The tax collectors and prostitutes enter the kingdom before you. Whoever humbles himself is the greatest. Jesus didn't just tear down the hierarchy, he turned it upside down. He placed honor on the dishonored. He placed value on the overlooked. He offered hope to the hopeless. He gave spiritual access to the spiritually rejected. This is why his message was intoxicating to the weary. 13. A culture where God felt distant. Most people in Jesus' day believed in God deeply. They believed he was real, powerful, holy, and just. But they also believed he was far away, difficult to approach, impossible to please, easily angered, primarily concerned with rules. They knew God was holy, but they didn't know God was near. They knew God was righteous, but they didn't know God was gentle. They knew God had standards, but they didn't know God had compassion. They knew God gave laws, but they didn't know God gave rest. This distance shaped everything. How they prayed, how they viewed of themselves, how they treated each other, how they interpreted Scripture, how they understood suffering, how they imagined the Messiah. Jesus' mission was not just to save people from sin, it was to reveal the heart of the Father. When he said, "Come to me," he wasn't just speaking as a teacher, he was speaking as God himself, extending a hand. 14. The people's expectation of the Messiah. The Jewish people longed for a Messiah, but their expectation was shaped by their circumstances. Given centuries of oppression, they expected a military leader, someone to defeat Rome, someone to restore political sovereignty, someone to elevate Israel above its enemies, someone strong, fierce, and victorious, someone who would use force. So when Jesus came healing, teaching, and welcoming the broken, he didn't fit their expectation. He didn't carry a sword. He didn't raise an army. He didn't speak of rebellion. He didn't overthrow Rome. His kingdom was not political, it was internal. His war was not against soldiers, it was against lies. His victory was not won through violence, but through love. This confused many, but it comforted the weary. Rome could crush bodies, religion could crush hearts, but Jesus came to set both free. He came with a kingdom not built on control but on compassion, not on fear but on forgiveness, not on power but on peace. In this kingdom, the yoke was not heavy, it was healing. 15. The rising tension between Jesus and the religious establishment. As Jesus healed, taught, and restored life to the broken, crowds followed him everywhere. The religious leaders grew increasingly alarmed. Why? Because Jesus was undermining the very system that gave them power. He offered forgiveness without rituals, healing without payment, wisdom without formal schooling, access to God without intermediaries. To the Pharisees, this was dangerous. They feared losing influence, losing authority, losing respect, losing control over the people. But most of all, they feared Jesus because he exposed the truth. Their system didn't work. When Jesus said, "My yoke is easy," he wasn't just comforting the people. He was confronting the leaders. He was declaring, "Your yoke is not from God. Your teaching is not bringing rest. Your system is not healing the soul. You are weighing people down, not lifting them up." This public exposure created tension that would eventually lead to the cross. 16. The people's quiet hope. Even before Jesus said a word, people sensed something different about him. He looked at them with compassion, not judgment. He spoke with authority, not arrogance. He touched the unclean without hesitation. He welcomed the outcast without shame. He taught with clarity instead of complexity. He called God Father instead of Judge. This stirred a quiet hope in the hearts of the weary. Could this be the Messiah? Could this be the one who finally reveals God's true heart? Could this be the one who gives rest instead of rules? Could this be the one who sees us not as failures, but as beloved? The hunger in the people was not just for miracles, it was for meaning, for mercy. for rest. Jesus' words were not merely comforting, they awakened a hope that had been buried under centuries of striving. 17. A world trapped between two yokes. By the time Jesus began his public ministry, people felt trapped between two powerful forces. A. The yoke of Rome, overwhelming taxes, political oppression, constant threat of violence, humiliation, and loss of independence. B. The yoke of religion, endless rules, heavy expectations, shame-based motivation, fear of disappointing God. Both yokes were heavy. Both yokes exhausted the soul. Both yokes created a world where rest was impossible. Jesus didn't come to replace one heavy yoke with another. He came to offer a third way, a yoke that was easy and a burden that was light. Not because life would be without challenges, not because discipleship required nothing, but because Jesus himself would carry the weight. He didn't say, try harder, do better, earn more. He said, learn from me, walk with me, I will give you rest. He was offering the one thing they had never experienced, a yoke built on relationship instead of religion. 18. What rest really meant to a first-century Jew. When Jesus promised rest for your souls, people heard something far more profound than simply a break from busyness. They heard echoes of shalom, a deep, wholeness-oriented peace, mind, body, emotions, and relationships all aligned. Sabbath, a divine rhythm built into creation, a reminder that humans were not created to live in endless striving. The Exodus story, freedom from slavery, not just physical slavery, but the slavery of soul-crushing oppression. God's promise. Through Jeremiah, ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. Rest was not a nap. Rest was restoration. Rest was renewal. Rest was freedom. Rest was God's active involvement in making life whole again. This was the rest Jesus offered. This was the rest people had been longing for, but could not find in their religious system. 19. The kind of people Jesus spoke to most. When Jesus gave his invitation, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden," he was speaking specifically to those who felt weighed down. These included A. The poor, those crushed under taxes and endless survival pressures. B. The sick, those labeled as cursed or unclean by society. C. Women often overlooked or undervalued in religious settings. D. Children treated as nuisances or irrelevant in spiritual matters. E. The uneducated, believing they would never understand Scripture well enough. F. Sinners and outcasts, those told they could never earn God's acceptance. G. The emotionally exhausted, people carrying wounds no one else saw. These were the ones Jesus targeted with his compassion. These were the ones he lifted up. These were the ones he called blessed. These were the ones he offered a well-fitted, life-giving yoke. Jesus' invitation was not for the strong, it was for the struggling. Not for the perfect, it was for the broken. Not for the spiritually elite, it was for the spiritually exhausted. 20. The cultural power of a rabbi's invitation. When a rabbi said to a student, "Take my yoke upon you," it was more than an invitation. It was an honor reserved for the most promising disciples. Only the best of the best were chosen. Only the smartest, most disciplined, most impressive were accepted. Jesus broke this rule. He invited fishermen, tax collectors, outcasts, the curious, the wounded, the overlooked, the unqualified. He welcomed people others rejected. He pursued disciples others ignored. He honored those society dishonored. His invitation was radical because it communicated one shocking truth. You don't have to be perfect to walk with me. Jesus didn't choose disciples based on merit. He chose them based on willingness. The qualification was not perfection, it was simply coming to him. 21. Jesus' authority to offer rest. Why could Jesus promise something the religious leaders could not? Because his authority was not human, it was divine. He spoke of rest, not as a suggestion, but as a certainty. I will give you rest. This was not the voice of a rabbi trying to interpret the law. This was the voice of the lawgiver himself. He wasn't offering a new philosophy, a new set of rituals, a new level of discipline, a new religious program. He was offering himself. Only God can give rest to the human soul. Only God can heal the internal fractures of the heart. Only God can lift burdens and destroy shame. Only God can make a yoke easy. Jesus wasn't just teaching rest, he was rest. This is why his presence calmed storms, why his voice comforted the terrified, why his touch healed the broken, why his words brought hope to the oppressed. He didn't merely describe the easy yoke, he embodied it. 22. A world ready for the revelation. By the time Jesus spoke, the words recorded in Matthew 11:28-30, the world was aching for a revelation of God's true character. People needed a father instead of a taskmaster, compassion instead of criticism, healing instead of humiliation, hope instead of despair, relationship instead of religion, rest instead of restlessness. The timing of his message was perfect. Spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, socially, the people were ready. They were exhausted enough to listen, broken enough to be open, hungry enough to hope. Jesus stepped into that hunger with a message that lit up their souls. Come to me, learn from me. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. For the first time in their lives, someone wasn't asking them to carry more. He was offering to carry their burdens with them. 23. The transition into the heart of the message. Everything we've explored in section 1 was necessary to understand one central truth. Jesus' words only make sense against the backdrop of a heavy, crushing world. You cannot appreciate the beauty of an easy yoke until you have felt the weight of a difficult one. You cannot grasp the kindness of Jesus until you see the harshness of the systems around him. You cannot understand the gift of rest until you understand the pain of exhaustion. Now that we've explored the world Jesus spoke into, we can finally explore the heart behind his invitation. In section 2, we will move deeper into his emotions, his tone, his motives, his heart, and the surprising kindness behind his words. Come to me. The easy yoke was not a theological concept. It was an expression of Jesus' tender heart toward the weary. Jesus meant when he said, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." It takes the viewer on a journey through the historical context of a yoke, the spiritual implications of walking in partnership with Christ, the release from self-imposed burdens, and the transformation that happens when someone finally sees, not just intellectually, but spiritually, how living under Jesus' gentle leadership frees the mind, heals the heart, breaks anxiety, and leads into rest. It ends with an invitation for the audience to personally experience that freedom.